On the night of the 3rd of August 1958, somewhere beneath a ceiling of Arctic ice, a nuclear submarine moved through black water toward a point no ship had ever reached from below. Inside USS Nautilus, there was no horizon, no stars, no periscope view, no surface to break through if something went wrong. Above the hull was a frozen roof that could crush a mistake into silence. Below it was the uncertain geography of the Arctic Ocean, still poorly mapped, full of ridges, shoals, and ice keels hanging downward like underwater mountains. The men inside the submarine were not simply crossing a line on a map. They were proving that the Cold War had entered a place where no army could march, no bomber could land, and no witness could see the battle begin. The Arctic looked empty on the surface. That was the illusion. In Washington and Moscow, planners understood what most of the world did not. The top of the planet was not the edge of civilization. It was the shortest route between the two nuclear superpowers. Missiles, bombers, radar stations, warning lines, and submarines all pointed north because geography made the Arctic impossible to ignore. But under the ice, geography became something even more dangerous. A submarine hidden there could become nearly invisible. A missile submarine protected there could threaten an enemy without ever surfacing. And an attack submarine sent there to find it could become a hunter in a maze where sound bent, compasses became unreliable, and the only escape route might be sealed by ice. This is the forgotten war beneath the Arctic ice, not a war of photographed invasions or televised battles, but a silent struggle of nuclear boats, classified patrols, sonar operators, oceanographers, engineers, and crews who entered a frozen world where a single navigational error could become a national secret. It was a contest over access, survival, deterrence, and the terrifying question at the heart of the Cold War. If nuclear war came, who would still be able to fire from the dark? Before we go deeper, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications because the most decisive front lines were not always drawn on land. Some were drawn in water so cold, so remote, and so classified that entire generations barely knew they existed. To understand why the Arctic mattered, we have to go back before Nautilus, before Polaris missile submarines, before Soviet bastions, and even before the world fully understood what nuclear-powered submarines would make possible. During World War II, submarines had already changed the meaning of naval warfare. But diesel-electric submarines were still tied to the surface. They needed air. They needed batteries recharged. They could hide, but only for a time. The Arctic ice punished that limitation brutally. A conventional submarine under heavy pack ice was not just concealed, it was trapped. If it needed to surface and there was no open water, the ocean itself became a prison. The early post-war Navy knew this, and yet it also knew the Arctic could not be ignored. U.S. Navy Arctic work developed through experiments, cold weather operations, and the work of men like Dr. Waldo Lyon, whose name deserves far more attention than it gets. Lyon and the Navy's under-ice pioneers treated the Arctic not as a blank space, but as a technical problem that could be solved piece by piece. How to measure ice thickness from below, how to navigate near the pole, how to understand sonar in water covered by ice, and how to keep a crew alive when surfacing was not guaranteed. The Arctic Submarine Laboratory's historical timeline traces under-ice experimentation back to the late 1940s, including USS Boarfish conducting early under-ice dives in the Chukchi Sea in 1947, long before nuclear submarines made the polar dream practical. This was the ignored factor behind the entire Arctic submarine story. The Cold War beneath the ice was not won by courage alone. Courage could get a crew killed if engineering failed. It was won by instruments, procedures, sonar profiles, ice measurements, maps, gyros, inertial navigation, training, and the patience to learn an ocean that refused to behave like any other ocean on Earth. The Arctic turned oceanography into military power. Ice charts became intelligence. Sound velocity became strategy. A pressure ridge could matter as much as a destroyer. A patch of open water could become a doorway back to the world. Then came nuclear propulsion, When USS Nautilus went to sea, the submarine ceased to be a vessel that merely dove. It became a vessel that could remain submerged for distances and durations that changed every naval assumption. A nuclear reactor did not need atmospheric oxygen to drive the boat. The submarine could make speed underwater, sustain operations, and cross distances that would have been unimaginable for diesel boats under ice. Suddenly, the frozen roof of the Arctic was no longer only a barrier. It could become cover. But the Arctic did not surrender easily. In 1957, Nautilus attempted to push toward the pole and had to turn back after navigation problems. The Arctic Submarine Laboratory records that a gyro compass failure at 87 degrees north forced the mission to end before reaching the pole. That detail matters because it shows how close the Navy was to disaster even before the famous success. Near the pole, conventional assumptions about direction become fragile. Magnetic compasses are of limited use. Gyro systems face their own problems. Charts were incomplete. The submarine was trying to do what no ship had ever done. Beneath a ceiling, it could not simply break at will. In 1958, the mission returned under the name Operation Sunshine. Even that name sounded almost ironic. There was no sunshine under the polar ice. There was only machinery, red-lit compartments, sweat, steel, and the knowledge that a mistake might never be publicly admitted. The first 1,958 attempt was aborted because of heavy ice in the Bering Strait, but the second attempt became history. Nautilus, commanded by William R. Anderson, conducted the first transpolar crossing beneath the ice and, according to the Arctic Submarine Laboratory's timeline, included the first use of an inertial navigation system in that context. On the 3rd of August 1958, the boat passed under the geographic North Pole. The achievement was immediately useful as a symbol. Less than a year earlier, the Soviet Union had shocked the United States by launching Sputnik. The satellite had passed over American heads and forced the country to confront the possibility that Soviet technology had leapt ahead. Operation Sunshine gave Washington a different message to send. America could move through the most forbidden ocean on Earth with a nuclear submarine. It was exploration, but it was never only exploration. It was a technological answer to fear. It told Moscow that the polar ice cap was not a shield against American naval power. Yet Nautilus only proved that a submarine could cross under the ice. It did not prove that a submarine could operate there freely, stop there, communicate there, or break through the frozen roof at the place of its choosing. That next step came with USS Skate. In March 1959, Skate became the first submarine to surface through Arctic ice at the North Pole. The image is almost impossible to separate from the strategy. A black American nuclear submarine rising through a white wasteland, steel forcing its way into daylight at the top of the world. What Skate demonstrated was operational, not just symbolic. A submarine that could surface through ice could potentially communicate, resupply in limited ways, receive orders, or prove presence. But every surfacing was dangerous. The crew had to find ice thin enough, or a suitable opening, or use the submarine's sail carefully against a frozen ceiling that could damage critical equipment. Surfacing in the Arctic was not like surfacing in the Atlantic. The submarine did not rise into open air. It rose into an obstacle. From that moment forward, the Arctic was no longer simply a place submarines could visit. It was a theater. And once Polaris entered service, the stakes multiplied. USS George Washington, the first U.S. ballistic missile submarine, successfully launched Polaris missiles while submerged in 1960 and then conducted the first SSBN strategic deterrent patrol later that year. The logic was clear and terrifying. A missile submarine hidden in the ocean could survive a first strike and retaliate. That survivability became the foundation of nuclear deterrence at sea. This changed the meaning of the under-ice world. If the ocean could hide a ballistic missile submarine, then the ice-covered ocean could hide it even better. The Arctic offered cover not only from aircraft and satellites, but from many forms of surface pursuit. It complicated search patterns. It distorted acoustics. It made access difficult for surface ships. It created a place where silence became armor. The Soviet Union understood the same reality. At first, early Soviet ballistic missile submarines with shorter-range missiles needed to move farther out to threaten targets. NATO focused heavily on choke points like the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap, where submarines moving from Soviet northern bases toward the Atlantic could be detected and tracked. The U.S. Navy's undersea surveillance efforts, including SOSUS, were part of that broader Cold War system. Commander. Undersea surveillance describes IUSS as supporting anti-submarine warfare by detecting, classifying, and reporting submarine contacts, with SOSUS dating to the mid-1950s and the name emerging from the early low-frequency passive detection work of Project Caesar. But the Soviet Navy did not stand still. By the 1970s, newer Soviet missile submarines, especially those carrying longer-range submarine-launched ballistic missiles, no longer had to run the same gauntlet in the same way. A major strategic shift occurred when Soviet SSBNs could threaten targets from safer waters in the far north, including the Barents Sea and Arctic approaches. As U.S. Naval Institute analysis explains, the introduction of longer-range Soviet SLBMs changed Cold War anti-submarine warfare because the U.S. Navy could no longer simply wait for Soviet missile submarines to come through the GIUK Gap. American attack submarines had to move forward towards Soviet operating areas. That was the war beneath the ice. Soviet ballistic missile submarines sought protected patrol areas near home waters. American attack submarines trained to find them. NATO surveillance systems listened at choke points. Soviet designers tried to make boats quieter. American designers answered with quieter submarines, better sonar, better processing, and boats built for dangerous forward operations. The battle was not measured in captured hills. It was measured in whether one side could trail a submarine without being detected, whether a contact was real or lost, whether a missile boat could disappear under ice, whether a hunter could enter the bastion and survive. The word bastion became central to this hidden geography. It meant more than a patrol area. It meant a defended sanctuary, waters near Soviet territory, covered by land-based aircraft, surface forces, submarines, sensors, and geography itself. In the north, that meant the Barents Sea, the approaches to the Kola Peninsula, and the ice edge beyond. For the Soviets, the bastion concept protected the nuclear reserve. For the United States, penetrating or threatening that bastion could hold Soviet strategic submarines at risk. And in a nuclear crisis, that fact was both a deterrent and a danger. Because if one side believed its ballistic missile submarines were vulnerable, it might feel pressure to use them early in a war. If the other side believed it could destroy those submarines before launch, it might be tempted to plan aggressively. Under the ice, the line between deterrence and escalation became dangerously thin. The Arctic was quiet, but it was not peaceful. The crews who entered that world lived with risks the public rarely saw. A submarine under the ice could not simply surface in an emergency. Fire, flooding, reactor trouble, loss of propulsion, or navigational error all carried a special horror. On a normal patrol, the surface was at least a direction of escape. In the Arctic, the surface could be a wall. Even finding a place to come up required knowledge, instruments, and luck. A submarine could be surrounded by ice too thick to break. It could drift under pressure ridges. It could misjudge depth beneath an ice keel. It could lose the bottom, lose the ice profile, or lose its acoustic picture in a world where sound reflected from the frozen ceiling. Sonar itself became a strange weapon under ice. In open water, sonar operators listened for machinery, propeller noise, flow noise, tonal signatures, the acoustic fingerprints of ships and submarines. Under ice, the ocean added clutter. Ice cracked, moved, groaned, and reflected sound. The underside of the ice was uneven. Keels extended downward. Ridges created shadows. The Arctic was not silent. It was filled with natural noise that could hide a submarine or confuse a hunter. The better the boats became, the more the contest shifted to tiny differences: a transient sound, a bearing drift, a faint tone buried in interference, a change in water conditions that could bend sound away. This is why the under-ice Cold War was also a war of scientists. Oceanographers, acoustic specialists, ice researchers, and navigation engineers were part of the battle. The men at sea carried the danger, but the men in laboratories made that danger survivable. The Arctic Submarine Laboratory became the Navy's center of expertise for Arctic submarine operations, developing knowledge, equipment, procedures, and training for one of the hardest environments on Earth. By the late Cold War, the under-ice contest had become more intense because the submarines themselves had become harder to detect. Soviet boats that were once noisy enough for long-range tracking improved dramatically. U.S. Naval Institute analysis notes that the late Cold War saw significant Soviet acoustic improvements, and that U.S. responses included forward SSN operations in the Barents and Arctic Seas, along with design choices reflected in the Seawolf-class attack submarine. The American public heard almost none of this in real time. That is why this war feels forgotten, not because it was small, but because it was hidden by design. Submarine operations depended on secrecy. Acoustic intelligence depended on secrecy. Patrol routes, tracking successes, failures, collisions, and close calls often remained classified or only emerged in memoirs, official histories, or fragments long after the fact. There were no front-page casualty lists from the Arctic cat-and-mouse game. There were no daily maps in newspapers. There was only the public knowledge that nuclear submarines existed and the private reality that they were playing for the highest stakes on Earth. The most dramatic part of this story is not that the United States and Soviet Union built submarines. It is that both sides built entire strategic assumptions around the belief that some submarines could remain hidden even after cities were destroyed. That is what made them valuable. A ballistic missile submarine was not merely a weapon. It was a guarantee that no enemy could be certain of escaping retaliation. Under the ice, that guarantee became even harder to challenge. But the same logic forced the enemy to try. If Soviet SSBNs could hide under northern waters, American attack submarines had to learn how to hunt there. If American attack submarines could threaten Soviet missile boats, Soviet forces had to defend them. If sensors could hear through choke points, designers had to make submarines quieter. If submarines became quieter, surveillance had to become smarter. The Arctic contest was a loop of fear and innovation. Think of the geography. A Soviet submarine leaving bases near the Kola Peninsula could enter waters bordered by Norway, the Barents Sea, and the Arctic Ocean. NATO planners watched the GIUK Gap because it was a gateway into the Atlantic. But the more missile ranges increased, the more the fight shifted northward. The battle was no longer only about stopping submarines after they left home waters. It was about whether they could be found before they ever needed to leave those waters. For an American attack submarine crew, that meant operating near the opponent's backyard. It meant being alone, quiet, and close. It meant listening without revealing your own position. It meant understanding not only Soviet machinery but Soviet habits. Patrol patterns, likely transit routes, readiness cycles, command behavior, and the acoustic personality of specific submarine classes. Much of that remains classified. But the strategic pattern is clear enough. The Arctic was not a side theater, it was part of the nuclear balance. The human reality inside those boats was more personal than the strategy suggests. Men stood watch for hours in compartments where the outside world existed only as instrument readings. A sonar operator might become the first person to know that another nuclear submarine was nearby. A navigator might carry the mental burden of knowing that a small error could place the boat beneath thick ice with no safe exit. A commanding officer had to balance mission pressure against survival. The crew had to trust the reactor, the hull, the instruments, the charts, and each other. There was also a psychological weight unique to under-ice operations. In the deep ocean, submariners already live in isolation. Under Arctic ice, isolation becomes absolute. The surface is denied. The weather above is irrelevant because the submarine cannot feel wind or see sky. Day and night vanish. The world contracts to machinery sounds. Watch rotations, stale air, and the quiet discipline of men who know panic is useless. The Arctic does not forgive disorder, and still, they went. They went because deterrence required presence. They went because intelligence required risk. They went because the United States could not allow the Soviet Union to turn the northern ice into a private sanctuary for nuclear weapons. They went because if war came, knowledge of that frozen ocean might decide whether millions lived or died. One of the hardest truths about this hidden conflict is that science and destruction were intertwined. Under-ice submarine missions gathered information that later helped scientists understand the Arctic Ocean. After the Cold War, programs such as SOSUS allowed civilian scientists to use Navy submarines for Arctic research, showing how military platforms that once served nuclear strategy could also collect data about the polar environment. NSIDC notes that SkySex was officially launched in 1994 after a successful 1993 feasibility test involving civilian scientists aboard a Navy submarine. That does not soften the Cold War reality. It sharpens it. The same measurements that could help science also helped submarines survive and fight. Ice thickness mattered to climate researchers and submarine captains. Bathymetry mattered to geologists and naval planners. Acoustic conditions mattered to oceanographers and sonar operators. The Arctic was a natural laboratory, but during the Cold War, it was also a battlefield waiting for a war that never came. The Soviet side had its own sacrifices, risks, and secrecy. Soviet submariners operated from harsh northern bases under political pressure, often with dangerous technology, limited transparency, and missions the public did not understand. Their boats were sometimes innovative, sometimes hazardous, and always central to Moscow's belief that sea-based nuclear forces could survive. The Soviet Northern Fleet became a pillar of strategic power because geography gave it access to the high north. Western intelligence watched it closely, and declassified CIA material shows that U.S. analysts were studying Soviet Arctic capabilities and the military implications of nuclear-powered submarines operating beneath ice as early as the Cold War period. This was not a cartoon struggle between machines. It was a contest between systems: American capitalism, industrial power, naval professionalism, and scientific research produced boats like Nautilus, Skate, George Washington, Los Angeles-class attack submarines, and eventually Seawolf. Soviet central planning, military urgency, and enormous sacrifice produced fleets intended to defend the homeland, threaten the Atlantic, and preserve nuclear retaliation. Both sides believed they were preventing defeat. Both sides built weapons that could end civilization. The Arctic ice made the contest more severe because it rewarded patience. A surface fleet could show strength with flags, formations, and port calls. A submarine force showed strength by not being seen. The greatest success was often silence. A mission might be considered successful precisely because no one outside a classified room ever heard about it. That is why the public memory of the Cold War often focuses on Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and missile silos, while the frozen ocean at the top of the world remains a shadow. But the Arctic shadow shaped decisions far beyond the ice. It affected submarine design. It affected sonar investment. It affected NATO strategy in the North Atlantic. It affected Soviet naval doctrine. It affected how both superpowers thought about second strike survival. And it affected the psychology of nuclear deterrence itself. If your enemy's submarines might survive under the ice, you could not assume victory. If your own submarines could survive there, you could deter attack. If both were true, the ice became a stabilizer and a nightmare at the same time. The paradox is hard to escape. The hidden submarines help prevent nuclear war by making a first strike less attractive. But the hunt for those submarines created risks of escalation because threatening an enemy's second strike force can make that enemy feel cornered. Beneath the Arctic ice, deterrence and provocation could look almost identical. A submarine tracking another submarine might be gathering intelligence in peace. In war, it might be preparing to kill it. The target might not know which interpretation to believe. By the 1980s, this underwater competition had become one of the most technically demanding military contests in history. It required nuclear engineering, advanced metallurgy, quieting technology, sonar arrays, signal processing, satellite communications, undersea surveillance, oceanographic modeling, and crews trained to operate in conditions where help might not arrive. The battlefield was invisible, but the cost of entry was enormous. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Many people assumed the Cold War was over and that the Arctic Submarine War had ended with it. In one sense, it had. The ideological confrontation that created the great under-ice contest was gone. The tempo changed, budgets shifted, public attention moved elsewhere. The United States fought wars in deserts and mountains. The Arctic faded again into the background. But geography does not retire. Nuclear submarines did not disappear. Russia inherited the Soviet northern position, the bases, the strategic logic, and the need to protect sea-based nuclear forces. The United States kept its undersea expertise because the Arctic remained a route, a shield, and a proving ground. The Navy still trains there. The Arctic Submarine Laboratory still exists as the Navy's center of excellence for Arctic submarine matters. Modern operations such as Ice Camp and ICEX continue to test equipment, tactics, and readiness in the polar environment. In 2024, the Navy described Operation Ice Camp as a 3-week effort to research, test, and evaluate operational capabilities in the Arctic region with participation from U.S. forces and allied navies. The Department of Defense's 2024 Arctic strategy also shows that the region is not a historical footnote. The strategy calls for greater presence, readiness, exercises, and the ability to operate in an environment undergoing geophysical and geopolitical change. The Navy's own Arctic blueprint emphasizes presence on, under, and above Arctic waters. That does not mean the Cold War has simply restarted in the same form. History rarely repeats that cleanly. The modern Arctic includes climate change, new shipping possibilities, undersea infrastructure, NATO expansion in the north, Russian military modernization, Chinese interest in polar access, and new surveillance technologies. But beneath those new issues lies an older truth. Whoever can operate under the Arctic ice holds a form of power that is difficult to see and difficult to counter. The forgotten war beneath the Arctic ice teaches us that some battlefields are not defined by explosions. Some are defined by endurance. The sailors aboard Nautilus did not fire a shot when they crossed the pole. But they changed the Cold War. The crew of Skate did not conquer territory when they surfaced through the ice, but they proved the frozen roof could be breached. The ballistic missile submarines that followed did not need to appear on television to shape world history. Their invisibility was the point. The Arctic also teaches that American power has often depended on a partnership between courage and engineering. Patriotism in this story is not loud. It is a crew trusting a reactor in the dark. It is an engineer solving a navigation problem no one has solved before. It is an oceanographer turning ice into data. It is a sonar operator listening through hours of noise for a contact that might alter the balance of power. It is a nation deciding that the most hostile ocean on Earth could not be left uncontested. And it reminds us that the Cold War was not only fought in the places we remember, it was fought in sealed compartments under polar ice. It was fought in acoustic signatures, patrol boxes, classified charts, and quiet rooms where officers studied contacts that never appeared in newspapers. It was fought by men who could not tell their families where they had been. It was fought in a world where success often meant returning home without anyone knowing how close the mission came to disaster. Today, when we look at the Arctic on a map, it can still appear empty. But the map is lying. Beneath the ice and the cold water are routes, sensors, cables, submarines, memories, and strategic fears that never fully went away. The frozen ocean remains a place where silence can be a weapon, where presence can be a message, and where the next crisis might begin long before the public sees anything on the surface. The war beneath the Arctic ice was forgotten because it was designed to be forgotten. but for the men who sailed there, for the engineers who made it possible, and for the strategists who understood what was at stake. It was one of the decisive hidden fronts of the nuclear age. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.